Okay, I think we may be sorted out here. So welcome everyone to Hibiscus Coast Astronomical Society meeting with the funny lockdown. Sorry about the delay, we had a bit of a problem here with getting things to run, but hopefully it's all working well now. If you could just pop into the chat and just say yes that you can hear me or no. Okay. Can you, Josh? Okay, so I'm going to start off with the news and then we'll be going off on to Josh, who'll be talking about Mars. Before we get going, just a reminder that we are not sure what's going to happen with the next meeting, so as the announcements come through, please keep checking through on the Facebook group, and we will keep updates there as well. The AGM, which should have been this month, we are going to need to postpone again. So we will have our committee meeting first when we get back, and then we'll decide on the date and get everything sorted out from there. Hopefully this lockdown doesn't continue for too much longer. Anyway, what's been happening above us? SpaceX SN10 Starship prototype was launched today. It's actually quite a good launch and a very, very good landing as well. So they were doing two things. They're doing a high altitude test and they were testing the landing. And in fact, both went off pretty well. The problem happened a few minutes after landing when this happened. So Starship SN10 did successfully touch down. So in terms of the high altitude test flight, did it perfectly, did all the maneuvers perfectly. The landing went very well, except for that one little thing. So although the explosion, of course, is a big disappointment, it's one less iteration to do. And that's in fact what Elon Musk has been doing. He's got a whole bunch of these things being rolled off the production line purely for this sort of thing. So in terms of it exploding, yes, it was a disappointment, but it's one more thing that he can then fix. And this engine was put in at the last minute, so there are a few issues there. So Musk aims to have an orbit this year, and the final spaceflight system to be flying people by 2023. And if you remember, I've spoken about the Dear Moon mission with a Japanese businessman who has asked various artists to come along on the flight. So that's all still on track for 2023. Of course, Starship is the one where they're going to be also sending people to the moon for moon landings and for developing a colony, for lack of a better word, on the moon. And of course, with Elon's well-publicized Mars missions as well. So Rocket Lab as well has just announced that they intend to build a huge new rocket that could fly astronauts by 2024. So this rocket, you can see in this picture here, unless you're on a small device, height of it's about 40 meters tall. It's about 4.5 meter diameter on the fairing. And it can take about 8,000 kgs or 8 tons to low Earth orbit, or 1,500 kgs or 1.5 tons to, say, Venus. And they've done this because they've just announced a merger with another company and ended up with a whole lot of capital. So the new reusable rocket is going to be called the Neutron. And of course, we're hoping that it's going to be launched down here in Mahia Peninsula. Astronauts will be flown by this thing, as well as mega constellations of satellites. So as we know with Elon and the Starlink, there are a whole bunch of other people that are wanting to do their mega constellations as well. And unfortunately, Peter Beck is helping that along with this particular rocket. I suppose it's all business at the end of the day. But they can launch a lot more for a lot cheaper, is what Peter Beck has been saying about this particular one. One of the other things is that the first stage is going to be reusable as well. So following the same sort of SpaceX things where they're trying to reuse as much as possible. Of course, they manufacture everything themselves as well, so cost is a lot better. Next up is the first space hurricane has been confirmed over the North Pole. And this is a little graphic showing kind of what it's like. So you'll see that there's like a central eye of it with all this activity going around it here. These are ionized particles which go up and then subside back down. So very, very much like a hurricane that we know within the atmosphere, except this one is 621 miles wide, and it's a swirling mass of plasma, and of course hundreds of miles above the North Pole. This of course creates northern lights as well, and if you have been following the post that I did in the group, there are a couple of webcams where you can actually see the northern lights, and I just randomly went on, and then yep, there they were, sort of live from, I think it was Canada, the one that I saw. The auroral spot is nearly circular flow, as I mentioned. It's a strong horizontal plasma flow, and Discovery said, oh, sorry, somehow got the wrong thing here. If we have a look at this image here, it just explains a little bit more clearly. So we've got ionospheric flow that goes around as in a vortex with the little eye in the middle. You've got field-aligned currents, so going perpendicular to all this swirling plasma. The electrons get shot out and it precipitates back down again. Just pretty much like a normal hurricane would. Some other exciting news is that the world's first space hotel, they're beginning construction in 2025. The company called Orbital Assembly Corporation has said that finally costs are low enough, thanks to things like SpaceX and Rocket Lab, and they are going to be, it's going to be called the Voyager Station, and if all goes to plan, it could be operational as early as 2027, so not too far in the future. So it's got everything that you would expect in a hotel. It's got all your rooms and whatnot, but it also includes themed restaurants, a health spa, and a cinema. And this is a rough artist's impression of it. Of course, you'll be in this part over here, in the circular part, which will be spinning, which will create your gravity. And you can see there's little parking bays there for loads of like little shuttles and stuff. And of course, you know, at any one time, there's not going to be just guests on here. There's going to be some staff included as well. And there's going to be a whole lot of other modules. Those modules will be leased or sold to private companies or governments. And so there's something for to look forward to. I'm assuming it's going to be pretty expensive when it starts, but who knows? Costs will probably drop quite rapidly once people start going and flights become regular. James Webb Telescope has completed its final functional tests as well, which is fantastic news. So over the last several weeks, they've been doing a number of different tests. They've confirmed that the observatory's internal electronics are all functioning as intended, and they've also done the stress test, which they shake it all around to make sure that it will survive launch, and all the stress is on there, and that went very well as well. Its 4 scientific instruments can send and receive data properly through the same network that they'll use in space. So that's all been tested, and it's been 17 consecutive days of systems testings that's been taking place. So all looks on track for the James Webb. There has been a bit of controversy in the last day or so as well about the name James Webb. Someone has said that James Webb was not only a fantastic scientist, but he was also renowned for making sure that LGBT people were kicked out of any institution that he was working on, and therefore he is homophobic and they shouldn't use his name in the telescope. So it'll be quite interesting to see what happens in the current climate, is whether we still have a James Webb telescope or it's going to change its name to something else. ESA is also working on a new mission to explore the caves on the moon. So this is an interesting one, because scientists have said that the easiest way for us to actually live on the moon is actually to live in the caves, because it's natural insulation, and your actual building work is only just like a little bit on the top. Everything else can be done in the caves or the lava tubes. So the proposed missions are to explore caves and lava tubes, and they've been looking at 3 different scenarios. 1, to find cave entrances. 2, to study the cave entrances to see whether it's feasible for us to do anything with it. And 3, explore lava tube using autonomous rovers. So it's all really important, because of course this is intended to build a lunar colony and to support a lunar colony. So you might be wondering, how do they find all these things? Well, there are quite a few of these caves already discovered. So if we have a look around here, like this one for example, you can clearly see it's a nice big hole, it's a nice big cave. This one over here and this one over here are lava tubes, as is that one there. We're not sure how deep they go, but obviously the deeper the better, because it's a pretty stable moon. We don't have massive moon quakes, although they have registered some. So there we go. There's a whole bunch of candidates there that could be used. Another interesting thing has been the Parker Solar Probe, which is obviously on its way to the Sun, has captured images of Venus along the way. So what's happened is, as it's going around, it's picking up more and more momentum, using Venus as almost like a slingshot to get more and more speed to continue its journey. So it's actually going to go 17 odd times around. This is about the 3rd or 4th one. So they thought, oh, while they're there, they may as well take a few photos, for good time's sake, I suppose. Anything's worthwhile looking at. And so the wide field imager for the solar probe captured this image that you can see over here, and it's on the night side of Venus, and it was taken from about 12,380 kilometers away. So as most of us know, when we look at Venus through a telescope, all you see is cloud, because it's so enveloped in cloud. And that's what they expected to see, these thick carbon dioxide clouds. Instead, if you have a look over here, this here, up here and around there, was the dark tinted shape of what's called Aphrodite Terra. So it's a series of highlands that they've already mapped on Venus, but they never expected to actually look through the atmosphere like this to see it. And there it is. So you might be wondering, like, what the hell are all these like little streaks and bits and pieces? Well, they're not UFOs entering the Venetian atmosphere, that's for sure. But these brighter ones here are actually cosmic rays interacting with the camera. These little fainter ones, they were saying, could be dust, and that which is actually from the solar probe itself. Bits and pieces from the solar probe, which are actually kind of orbiting around the probe. So it's quite interesting that we can see these cosmic rays very clearly appearing. Of course, if you remember to this, the Apollo missions and some of the space shuttle missions, astronauts were talking about how when they close their eyes to go to sleep, they'd often see bright flashes, and those were cosmic rays as well, just passing through the sort of visual cortex. So quite an interesting thing there. So this one should interest a couple of people. You can now buy space shares. So up until now, it's been quite difficult to get shares in things like Rocket Lab and SpaceX and all these exciting things. And I know myself and Chris and Brenton as well, we like playing a bit of the stock market. So it's pretty good news that Rocket Lab, as I mentioned, is going public after the merger with Vector Acquisition Corp. There's the ticker, VACQU, in the New York Stock Exchange. It's not available yet, but it will be quite soon. So that's a good one to keep an eye out on. Of course, Virgin Galactic stock has also been available since last year, towards the end of last year. Ticker is SPCE, or Space, which is quite a good one. And those are available currently. Some others that you can also invest in is Maxar Technologies and Aerojet Rocketdyne. Both of those are heavily involved with not only space but also defense, but quite an interesting thing that we can now buy shares. As soon as those Rocket Lab ones come in, I'll certainly be grabbing a few of those. SpaceX is, of course, the one that everyone is after, because Tesla and all of that's already been made public. Elon has said that he is not going to make it public for the moment. However, there is a lot of talk about it going public quite soon, because they'll need to raise a lot more money if they're going to sort of charge ahead with their Mars expeditions. So keep an eye out for SpaceX. It will probably go into an initial public offering quite soon. And that's kind of what's been happening above us. Let me see if I can get this thing. No, it's not going to go. So if there are any questions in the chat, I'll have a look. And John was saying, oh, they're going to change the name of Hubble too. It really makes you wonder. But anyway, there we go. So I'm going to hand over to Josh now. He's just going to pop up onto the... If I can figure out how to do it.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Sounds coming through.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. And as James mentioned before, sorry for the technical issues at the start. Yeah, sometimes technology isn't our friend in these cases, but we got there in the end. So tonight's presentation, I'm just going to share my screen. Here's tonight's presentation. It's Destination Mars, our journey to becoming a multi-planetary species. Now, as James mentioned in the email and Facebook, this is a talk that I've done before at this club. I think the last time I did it, though, was 2018. So hopefully there's a lot of new people that haven't seen this. If you have seen it before, I hope it isn't too boring. But it is something which I think is becoming more topical, because in this presentation, I spend a lot of time talking about SpaceX and Elon Musk's plan for Mars and everything like that. So yeah, let's begin our presentation. So basically, in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in space exploration. NASA, SpaceX announcing manned missions to the moon and then eventually to Mars. And I mean, James just talked about the space hotel. So it's looking like space tourism will be a big thing in the future. And it always makes me wonder, and I guess here's the part of the talk where I would normally ask the audience, but I can't see people raising hands. But I'm keen to know for all of you, if you had a chance to go to Mars, would you do it? And I think a lot of us would jump at the chance, would say, oh yeah, of course. But then ask yourself, if you had a chance to go to Mars, but once you got there, you had to stay there 2 years before you were able to come back to Earth, would you still do it? Maybe some people would, maybe some people wouldn't. But what if I told you, okay, you can go to Mars, you have to stay there 2 years, but there's a chance you might not be able to come back. It could be a one-way mission. There could be technical issues, something could go wrong. Would you still want to do it? Again, some people might say yes, a lot of people might say no, but I think, if we're talking about worldwide, I'm sure there'd be no shortage of people who would still want to go. People with, that kind of exploration spirit. And I think that there's part of us, of all of us, that wants to go to Mars because it appeals to the spirit of exploration. Because I think that we as humans have always been explorers. If we think back to our past, in the early days of humans, it was always a case of what's on the other side of that hill, or what's on the other side of that mountain. And then as civilization developed, it was what's on the other side of the ocean, and then what's on the other side of the world. In the 15th century, in the age of exploration, European powers set out to map every corner of the globe. And during this time, if you asked a European child what they wanted to be when they grew up, chances are they would say they wanted to be an ocean explorer. The stories of these explorers captured people's imagination. There was something romantic about going somewhere that no one had been before, being the first person to step foot on a new island, or a new country. I think it was the same spirit of exploration that led us last century to the space race, when the two great superpowers of modern time challenged each other to see who could get to the moon first, which led, of course, to 1969, the moon landing, where Neil Armstrong became the first human being to step foot on another world. It was a great time of excitement and interest in space exploration. And at that time, many of us thought that it would continue and that it wouldn't be long before we'd have a colony on the moon and then colonies on other planets. And during this time, if you asked a child what they wanted to be when they grew up, chances are they might say an astronaut, because again, it was that same idea of going out and exploring the unknown. Many of those children that saw the actual moon landing may have imagined that in the far-flung, distant future of 2021, that we might be living like this. And this seems funny to us now when we look at it, right? Like, well, of course, it's 2021 and we're not living like that. But, if you think about it from their perspective, it may have been reasonable to expect that things would continue. In a short span of around 10 to 15 years, we'd gone from launching our first satellite into space to stepping foot on the moon. So it's natural to think that it may have continued. But now it's been more than 50 years since we've been back to the moon. And since then, NASA for a while scaled back their space missions. They cancelled the space shuttle program. And for a while, there's kind of a slump. It seemed like the public wasn't really that interested in space exploration. What went wrong? We had so much momentum, and then we just stopped. When it's 2021, why don't we have a colony on the moon? In fact, why don't we have a colony on another planet? Well, there's one man that wants to change that. You might have heard of him. We've mentioned his name a few times already tonight. It's Elon Musk. And he is, among other things, the founder of SpaceX, whose stated goal is to revolutionize the cost of space travel in order to make humans a multi-planetary species by colonizing Mars with at least 1 million people over the next century. So in my presentation tonight, I'm going to explore how and why we should colonize Mars. And in particular, I'll spend some time looking at Elon Musk and the SpaceX story so we can see what they've done so far. Now, this presentation I've divided into 3 parts. So first of all, we're going to look at the case for colonizing Mars. Why should we colonize Mars? And then we'll look at the story of SpaceX and how they're going so far. And then we're going to look to the future and imagine what it might be like to live on Mars as one of the early colonists. So strap in and join me on our journey to becoming a multi-planetary species. So we'll start with the case for colonizing Mars, because by now I'm sure some of you may be thinking, why colonize Mars? I mean, if you think about it, space travel is expensive and dangerous. And just earlier in the news, James mentioned the most recent SpaceX launch. A perfect launch, landed just fine, and then a few minutes later exploded. With things like that going on, why would we want to colonize Mars? And with all the money involved as well, shouldn't we spend all that money on something else? We have plenty of problems closer to home, and it's very tempting to say, shouldn't we fix all the problems we have here on Earth before we go to Mars or any other planet? And we do have plenty of problems here on Earth. Problems like climate change, world hunger, poverty. All of these things are really big problems facing humanity. And unless we do something to change it, they're going to get worse. And at the moment, Earth is the only home we have. So it's tempting to say, why don't we fix up our current home before we go in search of a new one? But what if something happens to that home? Then we'd be doomed, because we have all our eggs in one basket. But if we had a second home, then humanity could continue. Now you might be thinking, well, it's unlikely anything's going to happen to Earth. I mean, big scale that we can't handle. Because when it comes to us as humans, we as a species think that we're pretty safe. Homo sapiens have been on this planet for 300,000 years. We're rulers of the Earth. We're top of the food chain. Nothing's going to come along and knock us off our pedestal. But just consider that the dinosaurs were around for 200 million years, and we all know what happened to them. 65 million years ago, dinosaurs ruled the Earth until an asteroid collided with our planet and wiped them out. And that asteroid was only 10 kilometers in diameter, which is tiny compared to the size of the Earth. And this picture here, the asteroid, it's not this red circle, it's this tiny white dot inside the red circle. You might not even be able to see it depending on how far away you're sitting from your computer screen or TV. But that little tiny white pixel is the size of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs and 75% of all the other species of life on Earth. And that wasn't even the worst mass extinction event we've had. When we look at the history of animal species extinctions, we can see the dinosaur asteroid is here. So for this one, we're pretty sure that 75% of all species were lost. We look back at these other ones. Look at this one, 90 to 96% of all species lost. So we can see that in the grand scheme of things, these things happen quite frequently. So it's just a question of, when's the next one? And of course, in our case, it's not just asteroids that we need to worry about. There are a lot of other things that come along and ruin our day. Things like a global epidemic. Last year we saw how quickly coronavirus spread throughout the world and basically changed the whole way we live. Fortunately, we were quick to respond. At least in New Zealand and other countries, we're doing a good job. But even here in New Zealand, it still sometimes gets in. But imagine if COVID were even deadlier, like as something like the Black Death or the 1918 flu, or even worse. That killed 50 million people worldwide, and that was before international air travel. Now these days, as we've seen, COVID spreads across the world. Imagine if there was something really bad that could potentially wipe out all human life. Or there's always the problem of irreversible climate change. Right now our climate is bad, but experts say if we act now, we can still fix things. But if we wait too long, we might pass that point of no return where nothing we do will change things. And there's always the risk of an impending World War III. It's been 75 years since the end of World War II, and since that time, most of the world has enjoyed relative peace. But also, since that time, our weapons have become even bigger and more deadly, and we now possess the power to end all civilization. And sometimes that power is in the hands of individuals who don't always think before they act. So any one of these things could lead to a mass extinction of humans on Earth, or at least put us in the endangered species list. And if Earth is our only home, then that could mean the end of humanity. So think about it. If all humans were wiped out, that means the end of everything that we as a species have accomplished. The end of all art, culture, music, of all science, romance, and laughter, all of it gone. But if we had a second home, then humanity could continue. So that's why Elon Musk and people like him say that we need to back up humanity. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. I mean, think about it. If you've got some important files on your computer at home, what do? You back it up to another drive. You put it on a USB stick or something like that. So in case that's lost, you still have something else. So Musk says that we need to do the same with us as a species. So when we're talking about colonizing Mars, we're not talking about a little research station that is still dependent on regular supply ships from Earth. We're talking about a fully self-sufficient colony that could continue to operate even if the ships from Earth stopped coming. And when people say, yeah, but shouldn't we fix all these problems on Earth before we go to Mars? Musk says, well, if we don't colonize Mars, then fixing these problems may not matter. I mean, think about it. We could fix all of these problems tomorrow, but if an asteroid hits Earth next week, we're still all doomed. So if we want to ensure the survival of our species for the next 100 or 1,000 years, we need to become a multi-planetary species. The longer we remain a single planet species, the longer we are at greater risk of mass extinction. I think this quote sums it up pretty well from the science fiction writer. The dinosaurs became extinct because they didn't have a space program. If we become extinct because we don't have a space program, it'll serve us right. So why colonize Mars? To ensure the survival of humanity. So now you might be thinking, okay, sure, we need to back up humanity to the moon or another planet, but why Mars? I mean, why Mars in particular? Isn't it fairly inhospitable? In the words of Bernie Taupin, who wrote the lyrics for the Elton John song, Mars ain't the kind of place to raise your kids. In fact, it's cold as hell. So just how cold is Mars? Well, let's compare the temperatures of Earth and Mars. So when we think about the temperature here on Earth, we know that it can be very different depending on where you are on the planet, whether it's daytime or nighttime, summer or winter, and it's the same on Mars. But if we average up the temperature on Earth, we can say that the average temperature here on Earth is 16 degrees, a bit chilly, but bearable, whereas the average temperature on Mars is minus 60 degrees. That's very cold. But how cold is that compared to the coldest temperature on Earth? Well, the coldest temperature on Earth was a minus 89 degrees, and that was registered in Antarctica in 1983. Whereas the coldest temperature on Mars, if you're close to the poles, is a minus 125 degrees Celsius. Okay, so we know Mars is colder than Earth. That's obvious, but what about the hotter temperatures? Well, the hottest temperature here on Earth was 57 degrees, recorded in Death Valley, California, 1913. Although this result has been disputed, and some people are suggesting that that result is faulty, and the real hottest temperature was a recording last year. But I think that was also in the same place, Death Valley, California. Regardless, it's around 56, 57 degrees. And on Mars, it's 20 degrees on a summer's day near the equator. So you might be thinking, okay, 20 degrees isn't that bad. So why don't we just set up a colony on the equator, where it's quite reasonable? But see, the thing is, Mars's atmosphere is 100 times thinner than Earth's. And so that means that the planet doesn't retain heat as well as ours does. So even though it would be a nice, tolerable 20 degrees during the day, a few hours later, the temperature would plummet to around minus 70 degrees. And that atmosphere on Mars, by the way, is 95% carbon dioxide, which we can't breathe. And since the atmosphere is so thin, it also leaves us at a greater risk of deadly radiation from the sun. So yeah, all in all, as the Elton John song says, it's not the kind of place to raise your kids. But what are our other alternatives? I mean, what are the other options do we have? Well, let's look at them, starting with Mercury. Being close to the sun, you'd expect Mercury to be pretty hot, and it is, with an average daytime temperature of 430 degrees. Now, that's so hot that if you placed a chunk of lead on the ground in front of you, it would melt into a puddle before your eyes, which makes it hard to imagine how we could erect any kind of structure on Mercury's surface, which we would need for a colony. And let's say you wanted to wait around for nighttime to come around to see if it cools down. Well, you'd have to wait a long time because the day-night cycle on Mercury is 176 Earth days long. That's a very long time between night and day. And when the night time finally does come, it's a temperature of minus 170 degrees, which is even colder than Mars at its coldest. And that's because whereas Mars has less atmosphere than Earth, Mercury has even less. It's almost no atmosphere, so it doesn't retain the heat very well. So all in all, not an ideal candidate for a colony. Well, how about Venus? Well, if you thought Mars and Mercury's lack of atmosphere was bad, Venus has the opposite problem, too much atmosphere. If you stood on the surface of Venus, you'd be immediately flattened by 90 times the air pressure we feel here on Earth. And the temperature on Venus is a scorching 465 degrees. That's even hotter than Mercury. Just like Mercury, it has a very long day-night cycle of 117 Earth days. But unlike Mercury, the temperature doesn't drop at night because the atmosphere is so thick that it holds it in. So in terms of a candidate for human colonization, I'd say Venus is even worse than Mercury. But you're probably thinking, what about the moon? I mean, it should be easy to get there. It's close. We've been there, so we know the way, right? And the moon is a tempting choice. And it's likely that in future, there will be some presence on the moon in terms of maybe a refueling station, a research station, something like that. But in terms of a self-sustaining colony that could continue to operate, even if contact with Earth was cut off, it leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, firstly, it has no atmosphere at all. On these other planets, we might be able to change the atmosphere over time with technology to be more Earth-like. But on the moon, we have nothing to play with. And there's really not much in the way of natural resources that we might be able to use to live and survive on the moon. And we won't even spend too much time looking at the gas giants because they're just that, gas. There's no hard surface for us to stand on. And it's hard for us to imagine a colony without floors. And plus, they're really far away. When you look at the solar system with the distances to scale, we can see the distances between the planets. Now, in this particular image, the size of the different things aren't to scale, but the distances are. So we can see that, from Earth to Mars, we're talking about this kind of distance, whereas from Earth to Jupiter, it's quite an extra ways away, and that's not to mention the other planets. And this is best case scenario when these planets happen to be lined up, very close together. So when we step back and look at all our options in the solar system, we realize that in comparison, Mars isn't actually that bad. I mean, yeah, it's really cold. The atmosphere needs some work, and we'd need to do something about the radiation. But there's a lot of good things about Mars as well. The day-night cycle is similar to ours. It's just an extra half hour. So, we think that human life and plants, we should be able to adapt fairly quickly. And besides, haven't you always wished for some extra time every day to get the chores done? Well, here you go. You get half an hour extra each day. And the gravity on Mars is 38% of Earth's, which isn't great, but it's thought that we might be able to adapt to that. And of course, there's frozen water on Mars, which is really good news because we need that. And as we've seen, it's relatively close to Earth compared to other destinations in the solar system. So when we return to the question, why colonize Mars in particular? Because it's our best option for now. Long term, if we're really keen to protect ourselves from disasters that could affect the entire solar system, things like a supernova or a gamma ray burst, then eventually we might want to leave our solar system. So for our survival plan for humanity, if step one is to eventually become a multi-planetary species, then step two would be to become an interstellar species. And then eventually we'll want to leave the galaxy and become an intergalactic species. But at this stage, steps 2 and 3 are so far in the future that we can't even begin to imagine how that would work. It's science fiction at this stage. The best we can do for now is focus on trying to achieve step 1. And the best way to do that is Mars. So how do we colonize Mars? Now that we understand the why, let's look at the how. And to help us answer that, let's look at Elon Musk and SpaceX, with the story of SpaceX. So the story of SpaceX starts with the story of Elon Musk. And Musk's story starts 1971 in South Africa. Now, as a child, he didn't enjoy school. He was bullied extensively. And he always found that if he wanted to learn something, he preferred to read books. At age 9, he got his first computer and discovered his love of programming. He began making his own programs and games. And at age 12, he created his own game called Blastar, which was good enough that he sold it to a computer magazine for $500. Not bad for a 12-year-old. But as he grew older, he kind of realized that he didn't fit in with South Africa. And at the age 17, he left South Africa forever. He went to Canada and then eventually to the US, where he ended up in the University of Pennsylvania. So while he was at university, he wondered what he would do with his life. And he decided that he wanted to do something big and ambitious to help humanity. So he asked himself this question, what will most affect the future of humanity? And he came up with a list of 5 possible things: the internet, sustainable energy, space exploration, in particular the permanent extension of life beyond Earth, artificial intelligence, and reprogramming the human genetic code. So when he came up with this list, he kind of looked at it and he was a bit unsure about the last 2. He wasn't really sure whether those would be good for humanity or bad for humanity. And at the time, he thought, well, there's no way that I can get into space exploration or sustainable energy. That would require too much money. So he decided to start with the easiest one, the internet. So in 1995, he moved to Silicon Valley, and over the next several years, he made millions of dollars with a couple of successful startups, including one that became what we now know as PayPal. In 2002, when PayPal was bought out by eBay, Musk walked away with $180 million. So now that he had that extra money, he went back to his list of things and realized that some of them actually seemed a bit more attainable now. It's funny how once you get hundreds of millions of dollars, more options open up. And so instead of taking his millions of dollars and retiring on a beach somewhere, he poured $100 million of his own money into a new startup, SpaceX, which, as we mentioned, it has the long-term goal of revolutionizing the cost of space travel in order to make humans a multi-planetary species by colonizing Mars with at least 1 million people over the next century. So right from day one, when Musk set this up, he was thinking about what we mentioned before, the importance of making us as a species multi-planetary, of colonizing Mars with at least 1 million people. And then a couple of years later, he decided to multitask and put $70 million into another startup called Tesla, whose stated goal is to revolutionize the worldwide car industry by significantly accelerating the advent of a mostly electric car world in order to bring humanity on a huge leap towards a sustainable energy future. And then, as if being CEO of two revolutionary companies wasn't enough, he's also the founder or co-founder of some of these other organizations. How much can one man do? I mean, is it any wonder that Elon Musk has become something of a legend in some circles? He's garnered a bit of a cult following. He was the inspiration for Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of Tony Stark in the Iron Man movies. And in fact, some people think that maybe Elon Musk is a real-world Tony Stark. You know, they're both billionaire genius philanthropists who have dedicated their lives to the betterment of humanity. But is it all just hype? I mean, Elon Musk has done some questionable things as well. In more recent years, he started up the Starlink company, which is responsible for the mega constellations of satellites that now block our view when we look to space through our telescopes. So he's no longer really the best friend of all astronomers. And in recent years, he's said some things and tweeted some things that have made some people wonder if he's going a bit off the rails. But regardless of what we think of Musk as a person, let's look at SpaceX as the company to see if it's achieved or started to achieve what Musk hoped it would when he set out. Because remember, the long-term goal, according to Musk, is to put 1 million people onto Mars. But first, Musk had to work out how to actually build something and get it into space. And the problem was, at the time, he knew nothing about rockets or aerospace. So Musk did what he always did when he wanted to learn something new. He read books, lots of books. In fact, he didn't just read them, but he memorized them until he could quote entire passages verbatim. And then he started hiring, looking for the best people he could find. And he believed that talent was more important than experience. Another thing he decided early on was to take risks and innovate. You see, at the time, most other aerospace companies were very risk averse, which meant that they would rather rely on something tried and true, even if it was built in the 1960s, rather than risk building something new. But for SpaceX, they wanted to build everything in-house. The whole idea is that they wanted to keep costs down, because at the time, a lot of other organizations, NASA and other aerospace organizations, they would often outsource their work to other organizations that would outsource it to other companies, and so on and so on. And every layer of outsourcing added on more cost. Whereas Musk was keen to build SpaceX as a vertically integrated company, meaning that they would build all of their own components in-house, maintain full quality control, and keep costs down. And with that as the foundation, they built their first rocket, the Falcon 1. And in case you're wondering, the name Falcon comes from the Millennium Falcon. So yes, Musk is a geek as well. And the Falcon 1, it was 21 meters tall, so it wasn't the biggest rocket in the world, but it was full of a lot of innovative new technology that helped keep the costs down. But the big test is, would it fly? So in 2006, they had their first launch, and it failed. Then in 2007, they had their second launch, and it also failed. And then in 2008, they had their third launch, which failed again. So each time, these failures were caused by tiny little things, like a single nut not holding up under the pressure, or the liquid in the rocket sloshing around more than was anticipated. So when Musk started the company, he figured he'd have money for 3 or maybe 4 launches, and that's it. All the money would be gone. So they'd already had 3. So he realized with this 4th launch, everything was riding on this. And he stated that if the 4th launch didn't work, he would pack up shop, close down SpaceX, and it would be a write-off. So fortunately, the 4th launch was a success. So SpaceX managed to put a dummy payload into orbit, becoming only the 2nd private company in history to do that. And the Falcon 1 became the most cost-effective rocket ever launched, at less than 1/3 of the cost of the closest competitor. And NASA took notice. At the end of the year, they offered SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract to make 12 deliveries to the International Space Station. So SpaceX had achieved the first step. They'd proven that they could put something into orbit, and they were getting money from NASA to put other things into orbit, money they could use to fund their real goal, to put 1 million people on Mars. But why 1 million people? Well, remember, we want this Mars colony to be a self-sustaining colony that's big enough to support itself, even if the ships from Earth stop coming. And Musk doesn't think that 10,000 or 100,000 people will be sufficient, but 1 million people should be enough. So that's why he's set that as the goal for SpaceX. But how do you get 1 million people to Mars? Well, Musk thinks that it all comes down to the cost of a ticket to Mars. If it's cheap enough, more people will want to go. Makes sense? So his goal overall is to reduce the cost of a ticket to Mars to 500,000 US dollars. That's roughly 700,000 New Zealand dollars. Now you're probably thinking, that's still a lot of money. I mean, I don't think I'd be able to afford a ticket to Mars. But to put things into comparison, in 2004, the then President Bush asked NASA how much it would cost to send 4 or 5 astronauts on a manned mission to Mars. And NASA went away and did the calculations and did all the costs. And their estimate was $450 billion. So that works out to be around $100 billion per person. Because remember, we're talking about per ticket. So in 2004, at that time, we could say that a ticket to Mars would have been around 100 billion. And Musk wants to get that down to 500,000. And in order to get the cost of that ticket down, Musk wanted to do something even more radical. And to explain what that is, I'd like you to imagine something. Imagine a world where airplanes only work for one flight. So imagine you buy your plane ticket, you get onto a brand new plane that's never been flown before. It's really clean. The plane takes off, gets to the destination, and then everyone jumps out of the plane using parachutes. And meanwhile, the plane flies off and hits a mountain or lands in the ocean, explodes, gets destroyed. So a plane costs around 400,000 New Zealand dollars to build. So that would mean that in this world where planes are only flown once, that in addition to the regular cost of a plane ticket, they would have to cater in the 400,000 million into each one, which means that each individual ticket would be around $2 million. So think to yourself, have you flown on a plane before in the real world? I know I have. It's been a while thanks to COVID and lockdown. But ask yourself, could you fly on a plane if each ticket cost $2 million? You know, it's crazy, right? And it's much too much for anyone to afford. The thing is, up until recently, up until, say, 5 years ago, this is how space travel worked. You'd spend months and months and millions of dollars building a rocket. You'd send it up into space. The payload or the shuttle would detach, and then the rocket itself would crash back down to Earth, burn up in the atmosphere, or land in the ocean. But SpaceX wanted to change that. So if SpaceX's first goal was to launch a rocket, their second goal was to land a rocket. Because if you can land the rocket, you can use it again and again. And then the cost of each trip goes down because you don't need to build a fresh rocket each time. So to help them in this mission, SpaceX started on their next rocket model, the Falcon 9. So they started work on this in 2008 after the launch of the Falcon 9. And the Falcon 9 was much bigger than the Falcon 1, as we can see here. And whereas the Falcon 1 rocket had 1 engine, the Falcon 9 had 9, as you might guess from the name. And 5 years ago, December 2015, SpaceX made history when they launched a Falcon 9 rocket carrying some satellites to space, and then they managed to bring the first stage of the rocket back down to Earth and land it safely. And then a couple of years later, they made history again by launching one of their previously used rockets. So SpaceX had shown that they can launch a rocket, they can land a rocket, and this means that they can reduce the cost of each flight. So their next goal was to build something even stronger and heavier, which is the Falcon Heavy. So the Falcon Heavy looks very similar to the Falcon 9, except it has 3 engine cores instead of 1, which means it has 27 rocket engines in total. And the first flight of the first launch of the Falcon Heavy was a couple of years ago. You might remember, it was in the news. The payload was Musk's cherry red Tesla Roadster. That's a bit of a tongue twister for you. Cherry red Tesla Roadster, which led to this iconic image of the Roadster out in space. You know, say what you will about Musk, but he's a very good salesman. A bit of cross promotion there for SpaceX and Tesla. Now, when the Falcon rockets launch, they either look like this with the big bulbous thing on top, which means that it's carrying a payload of satellites or equipment, or it can look like this, which means it's carrying the SpaceX shuttle, which is known as the Dragon. So the Dragon shuttle is about the size of an SUV, and at first it was just used to carry cargo, but recently it now has started doing manned missions as well. So you may remember that last May we had the first crewed flight of the Dragon shuttle, which now proves that SpaceX isn't just about transporting satellites and payloads. They can now send people into space. And remember, all of this, the commercial flights, the NASA contracts, all of this is to support the end goal, the long-term goal of reducing the cost of a flight to Mars so that we can put 1 million people to Mars, on Mars. So by now you might be wondering, how will SpaceX actually get to Mars? I mean, so far, SpaceX has been really great at putting things into low Earth orbit. So low Earth orbit, or LEO, is this range around Earth. And most of the things that we think of as being in space or orbiting are within this area. We can see here, this is the International Space Station and the Hubble. So, you know, so far, SpaceX has been great at putting things out here. But in all of human history, only 24 human beings have been beyond the LEO. And that was the 24 Apollo astronauts. And in all of history, no human has been further than the moon. So you might be thinking, well, how far away is Mars? Well, it depends on when you leave. You know, Earth and Mars both rotate around the sun, but Earth is faster because it's on the inside track. And every 26 months, Earth laps Mars and they're close together. And when this happens, it's known as Mars at opposition, because if you're on Earth and you're looking at the sun and Mars, Mars is on the opposite side of the Earth than the sun. Whereas when Mars is in conjunction, it means it's far away. And we call it that because if you're on Earth and you're watching them, it will look like the sun and Mars kind of join in the sky because Mars will go behind the sun. So that's where these names come from, because they can be a bit confusing, because you might think conjunction sounds like it's close. It sounds like it's conjoined, and opposition sounds far away. But it's actually the opposite. When Mars is at opposition, it's closest to us. So obviously, if we were to launch a Mars mission, we would want to do it during an opposition. And that's why during the last opposition, last year, October 2020, it was actually a really good time for a lot of missions to launch. The NASA Perseverance Mars rover, which has just recently touched down on Mars, that was launched during this window to take advantage of this closeness, as well as some other Mars missions. And during an opposition, Mars is usually around 62 million kilometers from Earth. It can depend slightly because our orbits aren't exactly round. So it depends on where the two planets are at that point in time, but it's usually around 60 million kilometers. And we've been to the moon before, but to put things into perspective, the moon is 380,000 kilometers away. To put that a different way, we can say that the moon is 1.3 light seconds away. So that means that it takes just over a second for a beam of light to travel from the Earth to the moon, whereas Mars at its closest is 3 light minutes away. So to put it another way, going to the moon is like crossing the English Channel, whereas going to Mars is like crossing the Atlantic Ocean, which means we're going to need a bigger boat. And fortunately, for a number of years, SpaceX have been working on a bigger boat, something designed to get us to Mars. And at the moment, it's known as the Starship. the SpaceX Starship. It's gone through a number of working titles throughout the recent years. For a long time, it was known as the BFR, the Big Effing Rocket, or in more polite company, the Big Falcon Rocket. But the new name is Starship, and this is the ship that SpaceX plans to use to take humans to the moon and then eventually to Mars. So the Starship consists of 2 stages. So when we talk about rockets, the different kind of sections of them are referred to as stages. So there's the super heavy booster. That's the stage at the bottom, the bit that provides the actual thrust to get it up into space. And then there's the Starship spacecraft itself. So it's a bit confusing that SpaceX uses the term Starship to refer to the whole thing, but then they also use the word Starship to refer to just this bit. So sometimes you might be reading a news story about a Starship launch and you're not sure, is it the full thing or just the small one? But the recent Starship prototype launches that have been happening, like the one that James mentioned, they're all about this bit. So at the moment, they are launching prototypes for the top part of Starship. So the whole height of both stages is 122 meters and 9 meters in diameter, which is pretty big in terms of rockets. So here it is compared to other rockets. And we can see that not only is it big in terms of size, but also in terms of payload. So this bottom figure here is how much weight these different rockets can carry into space. So Starship can carry quite a bit. Now, this is one of the earlier designs for the Starship shuttle itself, showing a cutaway. That's why it's a slightly different shape than it is now. And these designs keep changing because SpaceX keeps, how shall I put this in a polite way? They keep kind of making their designs a bit more realistic. Initially, the whole thing was going to be the size of a skyscraper with loads of different levels and things like that. So at the moment, we're not sure exactly what the inside of the Starship spacecraft will look like, but the idea, the hope eventually is that there will still be several levels of crew quarters, and it will carry 450 tons of cargo. Oh, sorry, that must be from an outdated one because our previous one said 150. Yeah, sorry, that must be from the earlier design, 150 tons of cargo. But Musk still hopes that it will carry 100 people. That's still his aim for this iteration of the Starship. But in future, he hopes that that might become 200 or 300 people with different designs in the future. And Musk has also stated his long-term goal for the Starship is that it has to be really fun and exciting. It can't feel cramped or boring. The crew compartment is set up so that you can do zero-G games. You can float around. There'll be movies, lecture halls, cabins, a restaurant. It'll be really fun to go. And that does sound fun. And it'll be fun if they can actually pull that off. But yeah, as I mentioned, every time SpaceX changes their designs for the Starship, it gets a bit smaller and a bit more pragmatic. So we'll see what actually ends up being launched. Now, obviously, for all of these missions, the plan is to launch them during the opposition so that the trip will be shorter. So the way the thinking will work is that in one opposition, a ship will launch from Earth, and that ship will go up into space. The first stage will drop down and land to be reused again for a future flight, while the actual Starship spacecraft will then remain in space. It will be refilled by another one that will already be in space, and then the spacecraft itself that's carrying all of our people, our 100 people, that spacecraft will head to Mars. And this could be a long journey. At the moment, it's estimated it could take up to 9 months. So eventually, 9 months later, the Starship with the 100 people will kind of flip and then land on Mars's surface. And then we have to wait for the next Earth-Mars opposition before that ship can go back. Because remember, the opposition happens roughly every 2 years. I think it's 26 months to be precise. So once you're there, you're going to have to stay there until the next opposition, and then that ship can return to Earth. You'll notice that on this end, we don't need the big booster rocket to kind of leave the atmosphere, because on Mars, there's less gravity. And the idea is that during that opposition, the first ship will return to Earth, and meanwhile we'll send a second ship or maybe a third ship. So that over time, eventually we'll get into this routine where every 2 years or so, there'll be ships ferrying people and items back and forth between Earth and Mars, setting up more things on Mars. You know, maybe some colonists coming home, maybe they've had enough on Mars, more people going there. And the idea is that over time, eventually, the number of people will build up until we reach the goal of 1 million people in a self-sustaining colony. But there's still a long way to get there. First, we have to actually launch the Starship. So far, there have been a number of launches of the Starship prototypes. Now, first of all, you'll notice this prototype looks a bit unfinished. It doesn't look nice and white and smooth like all of the other rockets. And SpaceX have said that's because it's a prototype. Some of these might explode. We're not going to waste money making it look all nice and fancy. But we can imagine that in future, this will be white and, I don't know, might have some beautiful SpaceX logo on it, something like that. So far, there have been a number of these prototype launches, and there have been mixed successes. We had quite a few successes over the last couple of years, but then we had a failure last year where it was destroyed on landing. So launched successfully, came back, and then destroyed. Followed by another one last month. And as James mentioned, just today, we had the third failed mission. So today's mission, something that looked a lot like this, launched successfully, went up in the air, came back down and landed, and everyone thought, great, perfect, another success. And then a couple of minutes later, it exploded. And they're still not sure why. So who's still keen to be on that first mission to Mars with all these exploding ships? Obviously, there's a few things to work out before we get there. So in terms of an actual timeline, like when is SpaceX actually going to get to Mars? There's no confirmed dates yet. There's nothing that they're really committing to. But Musk himself still says in interviews, he's highly confident that SpaceX will launch to Mars in 2026. So 5 years from now. Now, the first mission won't be a manned mission. The first mission will just be, let's see if we can actually get the ship there with some, I don't know, some probes or cameras or something. But still, that's exciting stuff. So it might mean 5 years from now, we could see something like the Starship travel to Mars. But will it actually happen? I mean, these deadlines have been pushed back so many times. And every time they revise the plans, the Starship, it gets a bit smaller and a bit cramped. So a lot of people are now saying, maybe SpaceX have bitten off more they can chew with this whole Mars thing. You know, or maybe they'll be beaten to Mars by someone else. With all the excitement that SpaceX has generated in recent years to do with Mars and space exploration, it's I guess, been a bit of motivation for other space companies to throw their hat in the ring. And now we have NASA now has plans to put humans in low Mars orbit in the 2030s. There's plans for a Mars base camp from Lockheed Martin, which is a spacecraft concept that could send astronauts to Mars by 2028. And there's also Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' space company. Now, Jeff Bezos has said that at the moment, he's not focusing on Mars. His mission is to get to the moon. He wants to start setting up moon colonies. But once that's all set up, then he wants to turn his sights on Mars. And the UAE, not wanting to be left out, have said that they will put a human settlement on Mars by 2117. I'm not sure how they came up with that precise figure. Maybe they probably planned that in 2017 and said that in 100 years, we will have a human settlement on Mars. So even if SpaceX aren't the ones to get us to Mars first, there's no denying that they've changed the aerospace industry forever. If we think back to even just 10 years ago or so, the state of play was that there wasn't as much going on with space exploration, and space travel was very expensive. And then SpaceX kind of came along. And, you know, I guess I kind of don't like using this word because it's a bit overplayed, but you might say that SpaceX disrupted the space travel industry. They kind of came along and said, hey, you don't need to keep using these old machines that are from the 1960s and out of date. You don't need to use contractors who then outsource to other contractors. You can make things yourself. You can keep the costs down low. And now, thanks to them, other companies like Blue Origins and other things are starting to pop up as well. So hopefully SpaceX has started another mini space race, you know, that same kind of challenge that got us to the moon in future. Maybe SpaceX has provided humanity that extra poke, that motivation it needs for other companies and organizations to wake up, which will help us get to Mars. So regardless of who gets us there, it's looking more and more likely that humans will probably be on Mars within the next couple of decades. And if you think about what that would be like, it'll be like the moon landing, but for a new generation. Everyone around the world watching the live feed of humanity's first steps on another planet. And that means that somewhere out there in the world today is the Neil Armstrong of Mars, the man or woman who will be the first to step foot on the red planet. And they don't even know it yet. Maybe it's you. But what would that be like to step foot on Mars as one of the early colonists? Well, for that, we can look to the future and speculate in the final part of this presentation, Life on Mars. So let's imagine that you're on one of the first manned flights. You've signed up to be one of the early settlers, and the first thing you have to contend with is the journey itself. This is an artist's impression of what it might be like aboard SpaceX's Starship. The journey will take a few months, so hopefully you get along with your shipmates. And it will be in zero gravity, which sounds fun, but it does have its health risks. When the human body is no longer has to fight against the pull of gravity, a lot of the body's key systems start to relax and kind of shut down. Bones become weaker, muscles lose mass. And see, this is why astronauts on the International Space Station must exercise for 2 hours every day just to prevent themselves from wasting away. So the International Space Station has special gym machines that have been designed to work in zero gravity, because a lot of gym machines rely on gravity. If you think about it, weight machines and things like that. So up there on the ISS, you've got special gym machines, which has made people wonder, will the SpaceX Starship also have a gym or special machines to protect the health of the people on the early mission? And so far, SpaceX haven't said yes or no. In some of those early designs, it looks like there might not be room, but maybe by this stage, they will have got to the Starship design 0.5 or something with the movies and the restaurant and the gym. So hopefully you'll have some way to stay healthy on that several months long journey to Mars. Now, when you finally land on Mars and step out onto the surface, you'll finally have gravity again for the first time in months. But it'll be a bit different to what you're used to, because the gravity on Mars is only 38% of Earth's. That's roughly a third. So that means that if you weigh 100 kilos on Earth, you'll only weigh 38 kilos on Mars. And that means on Earth, if you can jump 1 meter straight up into the air, on Mars, you'll be able to jump 3.8 meters. Imagine the basketball games on Mars. Imagine all the weird kinds of extreme sports that might develop if humans are living in an environment with a completely different gravity to Earth. But again, it's not all fun and games. You know, even though Mars has more gravity than space, it's still not as much gravity as we're used to. So it's still quite likely that there will be ongoing health risks. So for you and the other early Mars colonists, you'll be guinea pigs of a sort, and people will be watching that first batch to kind of find out what happens, what are the other things that we haven't thought of. But as you step out and you step onto the surface and look around, the first thing you'll notice the sky. You know, when we think about the sky on Mars, we usually think about images like this one, which show a dusty orange color. But that's just what it looks like during the daytime. At sunrise or sunset, it looks more blue. And that's because of the way that the light diffracts through all the dust in Mars's atmosphere. But some people actually speculate that during the day, the Martian sky might not actually look as reddish as this. That's because all of the images we've seen on Mars are photos which have been taken with cameras, and cameras don't adjust to low levels of light the same way that human eyes do. For our eyes, when we're in a dark environment, we tend to see blues more strongly than reds. That's why at nighttime, if you're outside, everything looks more kind of bluish tinge. So some people speculate that once humans are actually on Mars and we're seeing this through our own eyes, even the sky itself might look more bluish than we're seeing here. But I guess the only way to find out is to, step on the surface and see with our own eyes. But as you look around the surface of Mars, the other thing you'll probably notice is that the horizon looks a lot closer. And that's because when you stand on a planet and you look ahead, you can only see so far before the planet curves away from you in what we call the horizon. And obviously the distance of the horizon depends on the size of the ball that you're standing on, the planet. And since Mars is about half the radius of Earth, it's a smaller planet, which means the horizon will be closer. So this effect would be even more pronounced on the Moon, which is even smaller. As you can see in this diagram, if you are 1.7 meters tall, then on Earth, the horizon would appear to be around 4.6 kilometers away from you. Whereas on Mars, it'd be 3.4 kilometers away from you. And on the Moon, 2.4 kilometers away from you. So that's something that might take getting used to for those early Mars colonists. Imagine looking around and realizing that the furthest thing you can see is closer to you than the furthest thing you would have been able to see if you were on Earth, in terms of mountains and other things like that. So those are just some of the things that you'll notice when you first land on Mars: the gravity, the sky, the horizon. And of course, you'll experience all of this from within a spacesuit. Because if you take off the spacesuit while you're still outside, the lack of air pressure will boil your blood, the temperature will freeze you to death, and the sun's radiation will peel off your skin all at the same time. Not a good look. So early on, you'll have to do almost everything indoors. You'll live and work inside habitats that might look a bit like these ones, which are from the movie The Martian. If you haven't seen the movie or read the book, I do suggest you do. It's a really fascinating story. It's an interesting glimpse into the possible near future of space exploration, because it's not too outlandish in terms of its science fiction. It's a bit more grounded in what might happen with the technology that we have now, or the technology close to what we have now. And one of the ideas explored in the movie is farming, because the main character is stranded on Mars and forced to survive by himself. But fortunately, he's a botanist, so he knows a few things about growing plants, and he manages to grow potatoes using his own poo as fertilizer. So early on, greenhouses will be essential for growing plants on Mars. It could be really long greenhouses that look like this artist's impression. But for fertilizer, hopefully you'll find something nicer to use than poo. And of course, to water the plants, you'll need water. The good news is there's water on Mars, but the bad news is it's frozen, and it's mostly at the poles or underground. So it'll be a bit of a challenge, but it's thought that long-term, there might be some big infrastructure project which would be able to build a system of pipes or plumbing that will get the water from deep under the surface or from the poles and pipe it to near the equator, which is where we want it. Because chances are our colonies would be closer to the equator, where things aren't so severe. And it should also be possible to reduce oxygen on Mars. So NASA has been working on something with another organization, this little device here, which is called MOXIE. It stands for the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment. And that's basically a fancy way of saying utilizing what's on Mars itself to reduce oxygen. So this generates oxygen from carbon dioxide using solid oxide electrolysis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it uses some fancy method to make oxygen. That's the important thing. And what's interesting is that an experimental version of this has been included on the NASA Mars Perseverance rover, which is on Mars right now. So a small version of this is on that rover as a test. The idea is that it's going to try to generate small amounts of oxygen and then store it away in a tank just to see how it works. And eventually, once we send back that back to Earth, we can study it and kind of see, is this actually safe to breathe? So, you know, hopefully, if this kind of device does work, this could be sent ahead in one of those early ships to Mars. Maybe the first unmanned ship can carry a whole bunch of these in I don't know, some sort of habitat or something, which will make itself, maybe, so that hopefully, once you and the other colonists get there, there will already be some of these devices here, which you can set up and get into and get some oxygen going. But how will all of these things be powered? Well, the MOXIE device that we just looked at is powered by what's called a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG. And this is the same sort of electrical generator that's often used in satellites and space probes. But for habitats and other things on the ground, the thinking is that you'll probably use solar power. So a lot of studies have been done on whether nuclear power or solar power would be best on Mars, given that Mars's atmosphere has a lot of dust. You'd think that would block out, you know, heaps of the sun. But the thinking is, even if you take the dust into consideration, solar power is probably going to be more efficient than nuclear power. So we'll see. So at a high level, we've explored how potentially in the future, you know, there'll be ways for us to satisfy all of these human needs on Mars: oxygen, water, food, and power. But there's one more important thing that these days we as humans think that we can't do without, especially maybe those of the younger generation. I'm talking, of course, about the internet. So now you're probably all wondering, ooh, can I get internet on Mars? The answer is maybe. So basically, when you communicate over the internet, all you're doing is sending and receiving lots and lots of little messages. So whether you're watching a video on YouTube or scrolling through your Facebook feed, messages are going back and forth between your computer and a server somewhere in the world. And the fastest these messages can travel is the speed of light. And as we've established, at its very closest, Mars is around 3 light minutes away. So that means that, let's say you're on Mars on your smartphone and you wanted to check Facebook or do something on your device, you could click a link on your phone to load a link, and it would take 3 minutes for that message to go all the way from Mars to Earth. And then it would take another 3 minutes for the actual web page or whatever it is you're trying to load to travel back. So 6 minutes just to load something. And that's best case scenario when Earth and Mars are right next to each other. See, when Mars is at its furthest away from Earth, it's 22 light minutes away. So that would be, waiting 44 minutes for a round trip response just for one thing. But it gets even worse than that, because when Mars is in full conjunction, when it's on the other side of the sun, it means that messages wouldn't be able to get through because the sun's in the way, and that provides a lot of interference. And this conjunction period lasts around 2 weeks. So that would mean that if you're on Mars, it means that for about 2 weeks, every 2 years, you would be entirely cut off from all communication on Earth. So 2 weeks with no internet, no communications. And once communication is restored, that means a lot of Facebook to catch up on. So there are already plans underway to develop an interplanetary internet. It's still in the very early planning stage at the moment, but it's called the Interplanet, like interplanet, but net, I guess. So I'm not sure if you're supposed to pronounce it like interplanet, but let's just call it IPN. So the IPN it's a collaboration between NASA and an internet pioneer named Vint Cerf. He's considered one of the fathers of the internet, and he made a lot of the early discoveries that made the internet and the web what it is today. So the idea is that Earth and Mars will each have their own separate internets that will operate as they do, fast speeds. So if you're on Mars, you can use the internet to talk to other Mars people. And then whenever a message needs to go between the planets, the interplanet will kick in, and that will be responsible for carrying these messages across. And it will be smart enough to know that sometimes there'll be a long delay between the time sent and the time received. And it will also be smart enough to know that sometimes we'll have to wait 2 weeks and it'll just batch up all of the messages. And then once there's the connection available again, it can kind of send things across. So if everything goes to plan, if we're talking best case scenario and we're looking at this through our rose tinted glasses, everything works out well. Within a few decades of people arriving on Mars, there could be a thriving colony. It could look something like this artist's impression from a science fiction kind of point of view. And remember, at every Mars opposition, the idea is that there'll be more and more people traveling between the planets to and from. Some people will want to visit Mars to see the sights. They'll be intrigued by some of the spectacles as demonstrated in these SpaceX travel posters. You know, Phobos and Deimos, the two moons, Olympus Mons, all of these things that could be a tourist draw if we ever got to the stage where people could easily go between planets. You know, other people might be drawn about the whole opportunity of it all. It might be like the early days of the American colonies. You had people in the old world who would sell everything they own and save up everything they can for a ticket to the new world and to freedom, for more land, more opportunity. Yet maybe Mars will be the new world. Maybe people will be excited, like, I want to go to Mars to set up the first pizza place on Mars. I want to go to Mars to set up the first this or the first that. You know, once travel is a possibility and it's not super expensive, it opens up the door for entrepreneurial types to start heading over there as well, which again will help the colony thrive. And eventually we'll reach that point that Elon Musk is hoping for, 1 million people on Mars. It might be quite a long time before we get there, but eventually, hopefully, if everything goes well, there will be 1 million people. But even when we get there, chances are we'll still be living like this, under a dome. It might be big domes with all kinds of wildlife and nature inside them, but we'll still have that dome overhead to protect us from the Mars atmosphere and environment. But at some point, if we're really keen that we want to make Mars not just a colony, but a home, we want to break out of those domes and change Mars to be more Earth-like. So this is called terraforming. And it's an idea mostly from science fiction. And a lot of people still say that it is science fiction, that it can't be done. But the whole thinking is that, you know, with enough technology and enough time, we could conceivably start to change Mars's atmosphere to be more like Earth's. So in terms of how it could work, the thinking is that we could start by melting the ice on Mars's poles. Because remember, we have a lot of ice that's trapped there. So if we melted the ice, this would release trapped carbon dioxide and water vapor, which would thicken the atmosphere. And as the atmosphere gets thicker, the planet would then warm up, which would then melt more ice. There's been a lot of ideas proposed about how we might do this. Anything from putting giant mirrors into space to direct more sunlight onto the poles, and other ideas about like flying over the poles and releasing black dust, kind of like a crop duster with black paint, essentially painting the poles black, because black absorbs more light than white. So over time, it would absorb more light. And some people have even suggested, let's just detonate some nuclear bombs in space, very close to Mars's poles. So there's lots of ideas out there. I don't know how many of them are actually feasible. But one of the other ideas is that we could then start to release greenhouse gases. So if you think of all those horrible greenhouse gases like CFCs, all those things on Earth that are really bad for our atmosphere, well, the idea is we could build factories on Mars that produce CFCs, basically try to kickstart global warming on Mars for the sole purpose of warming up the planet. So it again melts more ice, gets a thicker atmosphere. And then we can start to plant seeds. First, maybe just some microbes that could survive in harsh places like Antarctica, and then eventually whole forests. Because once the planet warms up, there will be water, and it shouldn't be hard for trees to grow. But the last step, of course, is making the air breathable. And that's the one that might take the longest amount of time. Because even if we built these factories and changed the atmosphere and whatever, the oxygen levels on Mars will increase at such a slow rate that it could take anywhere from 300 to 2,000 years before the air is breathable. So unless there's a major technological breakthrough, it looks like the first hundreds of thousands of years, hundreds or thousands of years on Mars, people will have to be wearing masks all the time when outside. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Maybe all this COVID stuff is just some training for us to get used to wearing masks. So yeah, even if we had evergreen forests, it would still take 300 to 2,000 years. But eventually, if all goes well, one day, thousands of years from now, you might be able to look at a photo like this and you wouldn't be able to tell which planet you're looking at. And at that stage, Earth and Mars will just be two normal places. And it happens to take months to travel between them. You know, sort of like Europe and America before air travel became so convenient and cheap and affordable. So imagine how life, society, and politics could all change once we are finally a multi-planetary species. And remember, Mars is just the first step. Who knows what could be next? How long will it be before we're an interstellar species, or even an intergalactic species? It sounds like science fiction now, but who knows what's possible in time? We have a bright future ahead of us, and it all starts with Mars. And that is the end of my presentation. Sorry, it was quite long. I was keeping an eye on the time and realized, oh, this is a bit longer than our normal presentations, but I hope you found it interesting. And I just wanted to do a special shout out. As part of this presentation, I did a lot of research, and one site that I found very useful is Wait But Why. It's this blog site by a guy that does interesting articles about space technology and things like that. And he did a really interesting multi-part series of blog posts a few years ago about Elon Musk and SpaceX. And that's what really got me interested in the whole idea of going to Mars. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, why not check out the site? And yeah, now's when we would normally ask for questions. So James, have there been any questions?
Okay, there've been one.
You're on mute, James.
Okay, there's been one question about magnetic field on Mars.
Yes, that is a good question. I'm just trying to remember. I'm pretty sure that Mars does have a magnetic field. I don't think it's as strong as Earth's, though. I think that that was still.
Mars does not have a magnetic field because it doesn't have a liquid core.
Oh, right. I'm thinking something else. Yeah.
However, it's not that required because you can put a radiation shield out at the L1, that's the Lagrange point, and it's like a bit of a disk, and it deflects the solar radiation away from Mars. So there are ways of getting around that.
Yeah. I think in terms of the early days on Mars, I think the radiation would be a really big problem because we don't have all the benefits we have here on Earth to protect us. So it will definitely require a lot of investment and clever science and technology to try to help protect us.
So another one is, if people have lived on 38% gravity for decades, could they realistically return to Earth?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that's explored in a lot of sci-fi. I think they actually touch on it in The Expanse a few times. So the idea is that if you are born and grow up and live on Mars, first of all, the thinking is that you'd probably be taller. So the idea is that eventually, once we have Martians and Earth people, you'll be able to tell a Martian because the average height of Martians might be 2 to 3 meters rather than the average height of humans here on Earth. And yeah, if a Martian comes to Earth, the thinking is that they might need to go through some sort of week-long quarantine period where they slowly adjust to the extra gravity. Maybe some special little room that you can go in, and you're just there for a week or 2 weeks, and they slowly turn it up before you can deal with it, or that sort of thing. Some other science fiction writers say that maybe you won't be able to really get used to it unless you do some intensive training. Maybe it'll be like, if you're on Mars and you want to go to Earth for a visit, you need to, I don't know, visit the gym and do the special gravity training workout for 3 months before you get there. So that's one of the many things that we don't know for sure, and we won't know until we actually have human beings on Mars and we have the first human beings born and raised on Mars.
Yeah, I think that's about it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed the presentation.
So thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and yeah, just keep an eye out on the Facebook group. We also send the emails out for those members as to what's going to be happening in 2 weeks' time. Hopefully we are back to normal by then. And then we, of course, will have astrons around to talk about binoculars. And then sometime in a couple of months, I'll be back to talk about telescopes. So there are quite a few things coming up. Of course, we've got a 2-series talk from Chris coming up as well. So that's going to be a really good one as well. So thank you all for joining us, and have a very good evening. Bye.
Thanks. See ya.